A retired sniffing dog doesn't recognize his master after years apart. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Can their bond be saved, or is it lost forever? The sun dipped low over the mountains of Texas, flooding the horizon with hues of orange, pink, and purple. The peaceful scenery stood in stark contrast to the storm raging within Ian. At 37 years old, the former Army veteran was no stranger to battles, but this one, loneliness, felt harder than anything he had faced on the battlefield. Since leaving the Army 2 years ago, Ian had struggled to adjust to civilian life. Every day felt the same, hollow and unfulfilling. Therapy and odd jobs hadn't been enough to shake the weight of his memories. The nights were the hardest, haunted by vivid dreams of the missions he had carried out, and of Max, his loyal German shepherd. Max had been more than a working dog, he was Ian's partner, his protector, and his only companion through the most dangerous moments of his career. After Max was injured, the two were separated, and Ian had not seen him since. "Ian, you need to do this," his sister Sarah had said just days ago. "You need someone to keep you grounded. Go to the shelter. Maybe you'll find a dog who needs you as much as you need him." Ian hadn't been convinced at first, but Sarah's words stuck with him. So here he was, standing outside the town's animal shelter, unsure of what to expect. The sound of barking dogs echoed faintly from behind the gates. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with anticipation. For the first time in a long while, Ian felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in years: hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward healing. The shelter was small and simple, surrounded by rusty fences and a mix of barking and whimpering dogs. The faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air, blending with the occasional breeze. Ian walked slowly down the narrow aisles, his boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. His eyes scanned each cage, searching for something, or someone, he didn't quite know how to describe. Some of the dogs barked enthusiastically, wagging their tails in an attempt to grab his attention. Others sat silently, their eyes filled with a sadness that tugged at his heart. Yet none of them seemed to have the spark he was looking for. Ian's shoulders sagged, and he was about to give up when a young shelter worker approached him. "Mr. Ian," she said hesitantly, "we have a German shepherd in the back you might want to see. He's a bit special." Ian's heart skipped a beat. "A German shepherd?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting for a reply, he followed the worker down a quieter corridor to a more secluded area of the shelter. There, in the far corner of a cage, lay a large dog with black and tan fur. His posture was stiff, and his eyes showed weariness, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Ian's breath caught in his throat. He would recognize that dog anywhere. "Max," he whispered, his voice trembling. The German shepherd slowly lifted his head and looked at Ian, but there was no recognition in his gaze. No wagging tail, no spark of familiarity. Just emptiness. "He doesn't remember me," Ian murmured, taking a step back. His chest tightened, as if a part of him had shattered. But even in that painful moment, one thing became clear to him: he couldn't give up on Max. Not now, not ever. Ian stood in front of Max's cage, his heart heavy. The dog that had once been his loyal partner on dangerous missions now looked at him like a stranger. Max's eyes, once filled with energy and loyalty, were now distant and empty. But Ian couldn't walk away. He couldn't abandon the dog who had saved his life countless times. "I'll take him," Ian said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The shelter worker looked surprised but nodded. "Are you sure? He's been through a lot. He'll need patience and time," she warned. Ian glanced at Max, who lay still in the corner of his cage, seemingly indifferent to the world. "I know," Ian replied firmly. "But I owe him everything. I'm not giving up on him." Moments later, Ian gently guided Max out of the shelter and into the back of his truck. He spread out a soft blanket, hoping to offer some comfort, but Max didn't seem to notice. The dog climbed in slowly, his movements cautious and hesitant, as if unsure of what to expect. The drive home was eerily silent. Ian kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Max as the German Shepherd lay quietly, staring out the window. There was no spark of recognition, no sign of trust. It felt like a chasm had formed between them. But Ian's determination didn't waver. As he gripped the steering wheel, he whispered, "No matter how long it takes, Max, I'll bring you back to me." The drive to Ian's home was quiet and heavy. Max lay motionless in the back of the truck, staring blankly out the window. Ian glanced at him occasionally in the rearview mirror, wondering what was going through the dog's mind. Max, the once brave and loyal German Shepherd who had been his partner through thick and thin, now seemed like a shadow of his former self. When they arrived, Ian parked the truck and opened the door. "Welcome home, Max," he said softly, trying to sound cheerful. Max hesitated before stepping out of the truck, his movements slow and deliberate, as though every step was a cautious decision. Ian led Max inside, showing him the cozy space he had prepared in the corner of the living room. There was a soft new bed, food and water bowls, and a few toys Ian had picked up on the way home. "This is your spot, buddy," he said, patting the bed gently. But Max didn't respond. He stood still in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Over the next few days, Ian tried everything to make Max feel at ease. He offered treats, left food close by, and even tossed a tennis ball gently in Max's direction, hoping to spark some interest. But Max remained distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to corners whenever Ian got too close. It wasn't easy for Ian to watch. Every time Max turned away, it felt like a small rejection. But Ian reminded himself that the dog had been through so much, more than anyone could imagine. He decided to give Max space, knowing that trust couldn't be forced. One night, after hours of silence, Ian noticed a change. As he lay in bed, the soft sound of paws reached his ears. He looked toward the door and saw Max lying just outside his room. It wasn't much, but to Ian, it was everything. "You're starting to trust me, aren't you, buddy?" Ian whispered, smiling in the dark. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of their journey toward rebuilding the bond they once shared. Ian sat on the porch, the cool evening air brushing against his face. Max was lying in the yard, his body tense as he kept a cautious eye on his surroundings. Days had passed since Max came home, but the distance between them still felt like an unbridgeable gap. Ian sighed, his heart heavy. He thought back to their days in the field, when Max had been his constant companion, fearless and loyal. Now, that connection seemed like a distant memory. An idea struck him. Ian went inside and opened a small box he had kept hidden in his closet. Inside was a collection of items from his service days, medals, old photographs, and a military whistle he had used during missions. The whistle had been their signal, a sound Max had once responded to without hesitation. Clutching the whistle, Ian walked back to the porch and looked at Max. "Let's see if you remember this," he said softly. Taking a deep breath, he blew 2 short bursts on the whistle, the same pattern they had used in the field. Max's ears perked up immediately. His head turned sharply toward Ian, and for a moment, his body froze. Ian held his breath, watching closely. There was a flicker in Max's eyes, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't full recognition, but it was enough to spark hope. "Come on, buddy," Ian said gently, his voice trembling with emotion. He knelt down, extending his hand toward Max. The German Shepherd hesitated, his muscles still tense. Slowly, he stood and took a few cautious steps toward Ian. Ian stayed perfectly still, not wanting to scare him away. Max sniffed the air around him, his nose twitching as if trying to piece together a forgotten memory. Then, in a moment that felt like a breakthrough, Max reached out and gently touched Ian's hand with his nose. Ian's heart swelled with emotion. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "That's it, Max," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "You're starting to remember me." For the first time, Ian felt like the wall of distrust between them was beginning to crumble. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for Ian, that was all he needed to keep going. The days that followed were filled with small but meaningful moments. Ian knew rebuilding trust with Max would take time, so he approached everything with patience and care. He started with the basics, simple commands they had once practiced together during their service days. One morning, as Max lay on the porch, Ian decided to try again. "Sit," he said softly, holding his hand in the familiar gesture. At first, Max didn't move, his eyes studying Ian carefully. But after a moment, he slowly lowered his body and sat. Ian's face lit up. "Good boy, Max," he said, his voice filled with encouragement. Later that day, Ian brought out an old tennis ball. He tossed it lightly across the yard. Max's eyes followed the ball, but he didn't move to fetch it. Ian didn't push. Instead, he picked it up and tossed it again, waiting patiently. After a few tries, Max hesitated, then took a few steps toward the ball. Though he stopped short of picking it up, it was enough to fill Ian with hope. Max's behavior was cautious, almost as if he was testing the safety of each interaction. When Ian offered him food directly from his hand, Max sniffed it carefully before taking a small bite. It was the first time he had accepted food without hesitation. "You're doing great, Max," Ian whispered, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill. Despite these small victories, there was still a layer of tension. Max remained distant at times, retreating to the corner of the room or avoiding eye contact. Ian often wondered if they would ever return to the bond they once shared. But each tiny step forward gave him the strength to keep trying. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Ian looked at Max lying nearby. "We're getting there, buddy," he said softly. Max glanced at him briefly before resting his head on his paws. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was progress. Ian knew the journey was far from over, but these small moments gave him hope. Slowly but surely, Max was starting to trust him again, and Ian was determined not to give up. The night was dark, and heavy rain poured outside as a thunderstorm rolled through the area. Ian sat on the couch, sipping a warm cup of tea, while Max lay near the door, his eyes alert and watching the rain through the window. The occasional flashes of lightning lit up the room, followed by loud claps of thunder. Ian glanced at Max, noticing how his ears twitched with every loud sound. The tension in the air was thick. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the house, making the windows rattle. Ian flinched, and in that instant, Max jumped to his feet, his body stiff and alert. His ears stood straight, and his sharp eyes scanned the room, as if searching for a threat. Ian's heart raced as he watched the German Shepherd's transformation. It was the first time in weeks that Max had reacted with such intensity. Before Ian could move, another loud sound echoed, this time from outside the house. It might have been a falling branch, but it was enough to send Max into action. He rushed to Ian's side, standing tall and positioning himself between Ian and the door. His posture was protective, and his growl was low and fierce. Ian froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Max," Ian whispered, his voice trembling. "It's okay, buddy." Max didn't move, his gaze fixed on the door, ready to defend Ian from any danger. For a brief moment, Ian saw a glimpse of the dog Max used to be, the brave, loyal partner who had stood by his side through every mission. The bond they once shared seemed to surface, breaking through the walls of trauma and distrust. After a few minutes, the storm began to calm. Max lowered his stance but remained close to Ian, his body still tense. Ian reached out hesitantly, his hand brushing Max's fur. This time, Max didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into Ian's touch, his eyes softening as they met Ian's. "You remember me, don't you?" Ian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized that, in this moment, Max had finally recognized him. Their bond was back, stronger than ever. The morning sun shone brightly as Ian prepared for the day. Today was special. He had decided to take Max to their old training park, a place filled with memories of their time together during their service days. Ian grabbed Max's leash and an old, worn tennis ball. "Come on, buddy," he said with a smile. Max followed him cautiously but with less hesitation than before. The drive to the park was peaceful. Max sat in the back seat, gazing out the window. Ian glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noticing how calm he looked. For the first time, Max seemed less like a dog burdened by trauma and more like the partner Ian once knew. At the park, Ian removed Max's leash and held up the tennis ball. "You ready, Max?" he asked, his voice steady but hopeful. Max stood still, watching Ian closely. Ian threw the ball across the grass, and for a moment, Max hesitated. Then, to Ian's surprise, Max took off after it with confidence. He picked up the ball and ran back, dropping it at Ian's feet. Ian's heart swelled with emotion. "Good boy, Max," he said, kneeling to pet him. Max wagged his tail slightly, his eyes bright and full of life. It was a simple act, but it meant the world to Ian. Max was healing. That evening, back at home, Max lay beside Ian on the couch, resting his head near Ian's leg. Ian gently stroked his fur, smiling to himself. The bond they had lost was finally restored. They weren't just partners anymore, they were family. The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow across Ian's backyard. Max was lying by Ian's side, his body relaxed, his eyes calm. It was a peaceful moment, the kind Ian hadn't experienced in years. As he looked at Max, he felt a sense of completeness, as though a missing piece of his life had finally fallen into place. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond they shared. Both had been through so much, carrying scars, some visible, some hidden, but they had found healing in each other. Ian smiled, realizing that their journey wasn't just about overcoming the past, it was about building a new future together. As the evening breeze swept through the yard, Ian softly said, "We've got this, buddy. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Their story didn't end here, it was the start of a new chapter. One filled with hope, trust, and unwavering companionship. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. Share your own inspiring stories in the comments, we'd love to hear them. Together, we can celebrate the power of love and healing.